Nobody in Bristlecone County, Oregon could figure out why 11-year-old Milo Braddock spent every dry, dusty afternoon that July walking the 2-mile stretch of ranch road between his family's house and the county highway, kneeling at each fence post with a can of orange paint and a stencil kit, carefully brushing on a number. Not decoration. Numbers, in sequence, one post to the next, 40 of them stretching from the front porch all the way to the mailbox at the highway. Milo had been profoundly deaf since he was 3 years old, after a childhood illness that took his hearing almost overnight, and he'd grown up communicating in a mix of American Sign Language, lip reading, and the kind of patient written notes his family had gotten used to passing back and forth. He never explained the fence post project to anyone in words they could hear, and since most of the neighbors along that stretch of road didn't sign, and Milo wasn't inclined to write out a long explanation for something he wasn't sure they'd understand anyway, the numbers simply appeared, post by post, all summer long with no explanation at all. By August, half of Bristlecone County had an opinion about it. Most of those opinions were some version of harmless and a little sad. A deaf boy giving himself something to do with a long, quiet summer. Nobody guessed that within a matter of weeks, those 40 painted numbers would be the only thing standing between several families and a wildfire evacuation that went catastrophically, blindingly wrong. If stories about quiet determination and the surprising value of paying close attention mean something to you, this is exactly the kind of story we tell every week. Go ahead and hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And if this story moves you, tap that like button before you go. It genuinely helps this small channel find the people who care about stories like Milo's. Now let's find out what those numbers were really for, and what they ended up saving. Bristlecone County sits in the high desert of eastern Oregon, dry pine and sagebrush country where summer arrives early and stays late, and where wildfire season had grown longer and meaner every year the Braddock family could remember. Milo's parents, Dean and Carla Braddock, ran 900 acres of cattle range along a stretch of country where the nearest paved highway sat 2 winding miles from the house, connected only by a single-lane gravel ranch road that cut through dense stands of ponderosa pine before opening onto the county route. Milo was the youngest of 3, with 2 older sisters who'd both learned sign language alongside him as children the way siblings do, without much formal effort, simply because it was how their brother talked. He was a quiet, watchful kid, the kind who noticed the shift in cattle behavior before a storm and the particular slant of afternoon light that meant summer was tipping toward fall. His grandfather, Walt Braddock, had spent 26 years as a wildland firefighter before retiring to the family ranch, most of it on hotshot crews out of a base 2 counties over, and Milo had grown up hearing, or rather watching, story after story about fire behavior, signed and mouthed slowly enough for Milo to follow every detail. It was Walt who planted the idea, without meaning to, on an evening in early June when Milo asked him, through their usual mix of sign and lip reading, what firefighters did when smoke got so thick they couldn't see anything at all. Walt explained, patiently, about hasty lines, the practice of stringing rope or marked tape through zero visibility, smoke so crews could keep contact with each other and find their way back out, hand over hand, when eyesight became useless. He explained that, in the worst conditions, smoke didn't just block vision. It swallowed it completely, turned broad daylight into something closer to midnight, and turned familiar ground into something no one could recognize by sight alone. Milo sat with that idea for weeks. He'd lived his whole life depending entirely on sight and touch to navigate a world that mostly ran on sound. Sirens, shouted warnings, honking horns, the emergency radio his family kept in the kitchen that he could never actually hear go off. He understood something about zero-visibility navigation that most of his neighbors, however experienced, had never had to think through quite as thoroughly. If the smoke ever came thick enough to blind everyone the way it sometimes blinded him by default, sound wasn't going to save anyone. Something they could see or even feel with their hands in the dark would have to. He started with a rough sketch in his notebook, an idea Walt found tucked in the guest bedroom one afternoon and studied for a long time before signing to Milo. Slowly, "Show me exactly what you're thinking." Milo explained it the way an 11-year-old explains a fully formed idea he's been carrying alone for weeks. Sequential numbers, painted in bright reflective orange, on every fence post along the 2-mile ranch road, counting down from 40 at the house to 0 at the highway, so that anyone driving, walking, or even feeling their way along that fence line in total smoke-blind darkness would always know exactly how far they had left to go, and which direction led to safety. Walt didn't dismiss it. He also didn't offer to help right away, mostly because he wanted to see if Milo would actually follow through on something this ambitious alone. Milo did. He started in late June, working through the worst heat of the day because that was when he had the most uninterrupted time, counting posts, sanding rough wood where the paint needed to hold, applying a base coat, then stenciling each number by hand, and finally, once Walt quietly ordered a case of reflective traffic-grade paint after watching his grandson's first few posts fade unevenly in the sun, recoating each one so the numbers would catch headlights or a flashlight beam even through smoke. His sisters, Piper and Sadie, thought the project was strange at first, though neither of them said so unkindly. Piper, 15, asked him once, in sign, why he didn't just use his phone if he needed to mark distance. Milo explained, patiently, that phones died, that GPS signal on the ranch road was unreliable even on a clear day, and that in heavy smoke, batteries and screens meant nothing if you couldn't see 6 inches in front of your face. Piper didn't have a good answer for that, and eventually she started helping him carry paint cans without being asked. Neighbors along the county route noticed the numbers appearing week by week and mostly assumed it was some kind of hobby project, or possibly a school assignment that had gotten unusually elaborate. Roy Delacroix, who ran a small hay operation 2 properties down and had known the Braddock family for 15 years, mentioned to Dean at the feed store that he'd seen the boy out there in the heat every afternoon and asked, not unkindly, if Milo had taken up sign painting as a trade. Dean laughed it off, mostly because he genuinely didn't know the full explanation himself yet. Carla asked Milo directly one evening what the numbers meant, and Milo, tired and sun-worn from the day's work, simply signed, "So we know where we are when we can't see," and left it at that, not quite able to explain in a way he was confident his hearing family would fully grasp until they needed it. By the last week of July, all 40 posts were numbered, sanded, painted, and finished with reflective coating that caught the evening light in a way that made the whole road glow faintly at dusk, an effect Milo found satisfying in a way he couldn't entirely explain even to himself. The fire started on the 2nd of August, a lightning strike 2 ridges over that the initial dispatch believed was fully contained within its first 12 hours. It wasn't. A sudden shift in wind out of the northwest late that afternoon pushed the fire hard and fast across dry timber that hadn't seen meaningful rain in 6 weeks. And by early evening, the county issued a Level 3 evacuation order, go now, for the entire Bristlecone Ridge corridor, including the Braddock Ranch and 11 neighboring properties along the same stretch of gravel road. The smoke arrived before the fire did, thick and disorienting, dropping visibility on the ranch road to what Walt would later describe as nothing, absolute nothing, the kind of blindness he'd only experienced twice in 26 years of wildland firefighting. Streetlights, headlights, even the glow of the fire itself became useless smears in the haze. Cell service, already unreliable on the ranch, dropped out entirely as smoke and heat disrupted the nearest relay tower. GPS navigation on every phone in 3 vehicles evacuating that road simply stopped updating, stuck showing positions from minutes earlier that no longer matched anything drivers could verify by sight. Dean drove the family's truck with Carla, Piper, and Sadie inside, Milo beside him in the front seat, his hand braced against the dashboard, eyes fixed forward into a windshield showing nothing but churning orange-gray haze. Behind them, 2 neighboring families, the Delacroix and another household further up the ridge, followed in separate vehicles, all of them reduced to a crawl, headlights barely cutting 10 feet into the smoke. It was Milo who saw it first, or rather felt the change register through the windshield before anyone spoke, the ghostly reflective glow of a painted number catching his father's headlights even through the thick haze. He grabbed Dean's arm and pointed. Dean, who had been driving on instinct and fading memory of a road he could no longer see, found the number 26 glowing faintly at the roadside and understood, all at once, exactly what his son had built. They drove the rest of that 2-mile stretch counting down, post by post, the reflective numbers cutting through smoke that swallowed everything else, 25, 24, 23, each one confirming they were still on the road, still moving in the right direction, still 14 posts from the highway, then 10, then 5. The Delacroix vehicle and the 3rd truck followed close behind, using the same glowing numbers as their only reliable guide once their own headlights proved useless against unmarked fence line. They reached the highway together, all 3 vehicles, in smoke so thick that later news footage of the evacuation would show visibility estimated at less than 15 feet along that stretch of road. 2 other evacuation routes in the county that night saw vehicles pulled over, stopped, drivers waiting out the worst of the smoke on the shoulder rather than risk driving blind through unmarked terrain. On the Braddock Road, nobody stopped. Roy Delacroix found Dean 3 days later, once the evacuation order had lifted and families were allowed back to assess their properties, most of which had survived with only minor scorching at the fire's edge. He stood at the gate near post number 1 and said, plainly, "Your boys' numbers got my whole family out of there. I want you to know that." Dean told him it wasn't his idea at all, and when Roy asked whose it was, Dean pointed toward the house, where Milo was helping Walt check fence line for fire damage, moving in the easy, familiar rhythm the two of them had built over years of signed conversation nobody else in the county had ever bothered learning. The County Emergency Management Office reached out that September, after word of the evacuation reached them through incident reports filed by 3 separate families describing the same reflective numbered fence line. They asked Milo, through an interpreter his mother arranged, if he'd be willing to consult on a pilot program testing reflective sequential markers along other high-risk evacuation routes in the county, the kind of low-tech, no-battery, no-signal system that worked precisely because it depended on nothing but paint and light. Milo agreed, on the condition that the training materials include information about why visual systems mattered for exactly the reasons they'd mattered to him his whole life, not just in an emergency but every single day. Walt sat beside him at that first meeting, translating nothing, because by then most of the county officials in the room had finally started learning enough sign language themselves to follow along without help. Milo never made much of what happened that August night. When people asked how he'd known something like that would matter, he usually signed some version of the same simple answer. He'd always had to find his way through a world that assumed everyone could hear the warning. He'd simply built the kind of warning that didn't need anyone to. There is a particular kind of insight that comes only from living differently than the world around you expects. Milo Braddock had spent his whole life translating a hearing world into something he could navigate on sight and touch alone. And when the smoke finally came thick enough to blind an entire county the way silence had always surrounded him, it was that same hard-won fluency in seeing what others simply assumed they'd always be able to hear that brought 3 families safely home.